Shadow Madness for the PS1 is a great example of how having a brilliant idea and possessing the skill set to implement said idea are two very different things. It has the groundwork of a good RPG, but was constructed by an inexperienced team and numerous poor design choices. When Squaresoft moved their North American headquarters from Redmond, Washington to California, some staff decided not to uproot their families and make the move, so they formed Big Rain. The company was comprised largely of staff more familiar with the localization process than game development from the ground up. That, accompanied by the lack of funding compared to a company like Square, meant that starting a company off with a full-fledged console RPG was familiar territory but a risky choice. While in production, Big Rain moved to Seattle and was bought out by Crave Entertainment. In 1999, Crave released its very first PlayStation game ever, Shadow Madness. A mysterious explosion and an unnatural darkness has destroyed the hometown of the main protagonist, Stinger, as he ventures out from his homeland to find help for the survivors and the cause of the sudden destruction. He learns that the world around him is slowly being engulfed by similar catastrophic events and a plague of madness. What starts as a terribly cliched and frankly uninteresting plot gradually builds upon itself, splitting off into unexpected tangents that all seamlessly come back around to the main plot. The story is surprisingly dark at times, often depressing, and yet daftly manages to never lose its sense of humor. This is largely due to the cast of sarcastic and witty characters and their natural feeling interactions. The writing isn't comparable to games like Xenogears in terms of its masterful complexity, nor do the characters have the same timeless charm as something like Chrono Trigger, but it does hold its own. And perhaps the greatest asset it has is the dialogue itself. At the time, translations of RPGs from Japan often paled in comparison to the original text. RPGs have massive amounts of text, and a direct translation is never as good as a true localization, but time and often funding stuck gamers with something closer to a translation. Shadow Madness was a natively English game made for English-speaking audiences, done in the style of a traditional JRPG. Obviously and ultimately to its demise, using Final Fantasy VII as a template. Written by JRPG localization alums, including Ted Woolsey, who worked on the localizations of Final Fantasy VI, Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, and the Super Mario RPG. So for the time, the writing is remarkably coherent and natural feeling. That being said, it's not perfect. The characters have enjoyable personalities, but little development as the story moves along. This is more apparent than it otherwise could have been because the plot itself is constantly morphing into a deeper being as the story expands across the span of two worlds. Better yet, enough time and thought was put into this already fascinating world to compose multiple libraries full of books chronicling the entire history of the world. These, along with other lone books found along the way, could easily fill an average novel. The story is presented in some interesting ways as well. The initial party splits in two fairly early on, and as one party journey to another world beneath the land of Arcos. Instead of finishing Disc 1 and moving on to Disc 2, as per usual this time, each disc contains one of these two worlds, and you will occasionally switch back and forth from disc to disc as you venture. Traveling between worlds is one of the game's various mini-games. Travel Between Worlds, the first of several first-person sequences, consists of a first-person shooter in a submarine vehicle. It, like the lockpicking mechanic, feels like a nice idea, but not fully fleshed out and ultimately underwhelming. It does, however, show yet again how Shadow Madness tries to fulfill many great ideas, but falls short in its final form. Another is combat. Very Final Fantasy VII at first glance, it has an odd control scheme where instead of drop-down menus, you switch between action categories with the L and R buttons before selecting an action. To physically attack something, you must first engage the target. At this point, you can choose between a guarded attack, normal attack, or aggressive attack, but only the normal attack is useful. Guarded is pointless. Aggressive attacks cause more damage, but have a higher chance of missing. Normal attacks have a higher hit percentage than aggressive attacks, but cause less damage. Except that's not really true, because while doing a normal attack, if you hit X at the precise moment you are about to swing, it counts as 2 attacks, so you get double the damage. The poor choices continue. The game has an adjustable difficulty scale, something that's not all that common in JRPG style games of the time. But it's really a choice between my first RPG level and average FF game difficulty. Nocturne this is not. This isn't a huge problem, however, since you won't be fighting very often. One rather clever game mechanic is the way you can skip nearly all the random battles in the game. Every time a random battle is about to commence, you will hear a monster roar in the background. If you hit the duck buttons in time, your on-screen character will flop to the ground for a few seconds, avoiding the battle. It doesn't work all the time, but I was usually able to skip 7 or 8 out of every 10 battles or so. On top of that, you will quickly reach a point in the game where random battles are meaningless unless you need more money for some new equipment, as the level cap is 15. Yeah, 15, and you gain levels at a fairly standard rate for similar RPGs of the time. That's like hitting the level cap in Final Fantasy VII when you leave Midgar. I've played Shadow Madness twice over the years, and both times I started hitting the level cap less than halfway through the game. But of course, you don't have to wait that long to reach the level cap, because another overlooked design flaw is a way to break what little difficulty the game has. In one of the first cities you visit, there's a gang hanging out by a graveyard that will challenge you to a battle for 100 gold. For starters, if you win, you get to keep your 100 gold and take theirs. And you can challenge them infinitely with no consequences. Plus, they are not difficult, and they give you more experience than either of the first 2 bosses in the game. You can max out your initial party of 3 in about 2 hours, depending on how much combat you did up to this point in the game. Another issue is the way you access menus. Instead of a single main screen to access equipment, items, etc., each category is mapped to a different button, much like in combat. There's also a strict item limit, but instead of forcing you to make some difficult and interesting choices regarding what you carry with you, as in Resident Evil or the like, it's merely annoying, as you will constantly be bombarded with items to pick up to a typical Final Fantasy level, but worse as the majority of items that you find are useless, including things like pots and pans and spoons. One great feature is the ability to skip lengthy summon and spell animations, unlike its Final Fantasy influence. But its welcome inclusion is only because the animations are hideous. Easily the worst part of the game, Shadow Madness is a perfect example of story over visuals I've ever come across. The spell and summon animations are bland and lifeless, but at least they play smoothly, unlike the small number of short FMV sequences throughout the game, which are full of choppy, low-quality animation and are rarely used to further the story in any meaningful way. It's readily apparent that different parts of the game's visuals, FM scenes especially, were handled either by different teams or at different points in development, either as Big Rain or after the purchase of Crave Entertainment. I love 3D models on pre-rendered backgrounds. It's easily my favorite visual style for a video game, but while the pre-rendered backgrounds are varied and usually well done, they lack a certain artistic flair or any true sense of imagination, but rather a sense of generic inspiration from far better visual sources. Everything about the presentation tries to mimic the style of Final Fantasy VII, but in a more fantasy-themed world, and it fails miserably. The character models are ugly. They are so low poly count they barely look like they belong as a PS1 launch title. The creature designs are all terrible, and the character designs are pathetic and as generic as the character names. Visually, one saving grace is the world map. It is literally a map, and beautifully done with dozens of creative paintings marking significant points around the world. Plus, each is accompanied by some further glimpse into the history or mythology of the world. My favorite is what looks like a giant farting the mountains into existence. The overworld adds to a sense of rich history that is often hidden behind the game's numerous flaws. Thankfully, the sound department is closer to the caliber of the story than its visual or gameplay designs. Sound effects are lacking, but the musical score itself is very well done. Many songs have more than a passing similarity to familiar Final Fantasy tunes, but the overall sound design is appropriately atmospheric, and there are multiple memorable battle themes. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's one of my favorite RPG soundtracks, but I wouldn't mind owning it. If Shadow Madness was a novel, I'd recommend it more than I do the game. Its characters lack the growth and development the plot sets up for them, but they are likable, the story itself is compelling, and the world building is rather fantastic. It's a flawed experience marred by some odd interface choices, a case of trying out too many interesting ideas without perfecting any of them, and some of the worst character models and designs I've ever seen. But it's certainly not an unenjoyable experience to play through, and the story itself is worth your time. I understand its poor sales and reviews when it was released. Sadly, the worst part of the entire game is easily the first 2 or 3 hours. You are immediately smacked in the face with the visuals. The beginning of the story is horribly cliched, and the depth of the history and future plot development isn't obvious until several hours into the experience. And for some reason, even the witty dialogue, one of the game's best points, is oddly off at the beginning. You look like death eating a cracker? Seriously? But if you're able to force yourself through those opening hours, there is a decent RPG to greet you.